Greetings and welcome everybody to the 34th Annual Marine Money Conference. It is great to stand up here at the pier and see all of you. Okay, that's next year's opening. While we cannot see each other and be together, I wish you could see myself and Morton standing next to each other because we're both wearing our white suits. It is an enormous pleasure to welcome you to an inspiring discussion which I could not be more proud to introduce. I would like to thank DNB, Ardmore, Marsoft, the Global Maritime Forum, and the Environmental Defense Fund for their support at our opening. At a time when the world is roiled by a pandemic and the continuing evil of a systemic racism, we're heartened by the best of humanity who have been collectively marshaling the talent, energy, and wisdom to confront those challenges. We have shown that when confronted by global challenges, humanity can rise to meet those. 1 year ago, the Global Maritime Forum announced the launch of the Poseidon Principles at Marine Money Week. And we were encouraged, thrilled, in fact, that our industry would take a lead against yet another existential global threat, climate change. Today, 5 astonishingly talented industry leaders will reinforce last year's message. Just before we introduce you to the Global Maritime Forum's Director, Joanna Christensen, who will lead the discussions amongst 4 people I'm honored to consider friends and colleagues. As they inspire us at the start of Marine Money Week, I will turn you over now to the producer of Marine Money's webinar series, John Chia, for a few introductory comments on how to run this thing. Thank you all. Have a great week.
Hello everyone, this is John Chia. Just a quick note on how we will be handling the Q&A session today. For this webinar, the audience, you, will be muted to ensure audio quality control. During this webinar, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions to the panelists. We highly encourage this, as this is why we do these sessions as live events, so that the audience has a chance to engage with the speakers and vice versa. To ask a question, you simply have to, To ask a question, simply enter your question in the text box at the bottom of the control panel where it says questions, like shown on my screen. I will receive them, and at the end of the webinar, I will ask the questions on your behalf. These questions will be anonymous, so there should be no fear of a stupid question. Finally, if you want to collapse your menu to see all the bright cherry faces, simply click on the orange/red box with the arrow in it, and it should collapse the menu. Now, with all that said, I will hand it over to Joanna Christensen, the Director of the Global Maritime Forum, whose inspiring work, along with her colleagues, will see our industry lead the world into getting to zero. Over to you, Joanna.
Thank you so much, Jim and John, and the rest of the Marine Money team for inviting us to discuss this exciting topic of the trillion-dollar opportunity. So how to decarbonize the shipping industry. So I also wish we would be having this conversation in person, especially in light of last year's launch of the Poseidon Principles. It would have been great to celebrate that together with you. But while we're each joining from our respective homes and offices, I hope that you're all in good health and safety. It's great to see so many of you join us here today, especially those that are joining us very late or very early, which I imagine is the case for at least some of you out there. And I hope that you will join the conversation through your questions, as Jonathan just encouraged you to do also. I'm especially pleased to be part of this conversation, as is at the heart of what the Global Maritime Forum is all about, working together across all parts of the maritime spectrum and the maritime system to tackle the biggest challenges and opportunities for the industry. So without further ado, let me introduce today's speakers. With us today, we have Tony Gurnee, CEO of Ardmore, leading tanker owner committed to sustainable shipping operations. Ted Jadick, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, it just occurred to me, it never even occurred to me to ask you how it's pronounced. President and CEO of DNB Markets in the US. One of the original signatories and architects of the Poseidon Principles, launched a year ago and designed to support the kind of leadership that I think Tony will be speaking about. Arlie Sterling, CEO of Marsoft, which together with MIT Labs has developed a rigorously tested data-driven platform to evaluate emissions reductions options and demonstrate their value to the market. And finally, Aoife O'Leary, International Climate Director at EDF, Environmental Defence Fund, a leading environmental NGO pushing for material global policy actions at the IMO. So I'm actually going to kick us off from our last introduced speaker, Aoife. I'm going to go with you first. Could you give us a brief overview of sort of the scale of the challenge that we're facing here?
Absolutely, thank you. So I am going to go through two brief slides. The first one is on the IMO target, and the second is on the penetration of zero emission vessels going out to 2050. So hopefully you can all see my first slide first. So this is a quick graphic of what the IMO has set itself as a target for reducing emissions. So by 2050, the IMO wants international shipping emissions to be reduced by at least 50% compared to 2008 levels. So you can see the dotted green line that goes down the screen. That's what we're aiming for by 2050. And that blue range is our best predictions of where the emissions would be in a business as usual scenario. So you can see immediately that there is a big gap in between the two. And even if emissions are at the very bottom of that prediction, that's still a substantial gap. And I wanted to add to that as well, not to alarm everyone, but 50% is not actually in line with the Paris Agreement. In order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, we need to reduce by at least 70% to get to a temperature increase of just 2 degrees. And to get to 1.5, you're really aiming for a complete reduction down to 0. However, I am an optimist at heart, and I think it's very possible. And so my next slide is going to show a little bit more about the technologies. So what this shows is it's another prediction. So I'm sure a lot of you watching will have different ideas about this, and I'd actually love to hear from you if you do, if you think we're out by 5 or 10 years. Hopefully you're more ambitious than I am. But what this shows is really different ways that ammonia can be used in shipping as a fuel, and when we think they will be developed, demonstrated, and then adopted at scale. So you can see the different timelines. But this is really just to concentrate our minds about how capital intensive the shipping industry is. Ships last 20 to 30 years. And so when we're talking about a 2050 target, we really need to be talking about tomorrow and making sure our actions actually start to reduce emissions tomorrow. And this focuses specifically on ammonia because it's from a report we did last year looking at ammonia as one of the most promising fuels. There are other fuels, there are other technologies, so this doesn't pretend to be a comprehensive assessment, but just to give that kind of flavor. And I'm sure my other panelists will be able to talk a lot more in detail about those topics. Thanks.
And indeed, I'm going to go to Tony next, because obviously at an industry level, this is a challenge, but for a company like Ardmore, it's also an opportunity. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yep, thank you, Johanna. And thank you, Marine Money, for the opportunity to participate on what is really such an interesting panel and an important topic. I think Aoife has done a great job in framing up the enormity of the challenge that our industry faces in the coming years and even decades. If it unfolds anything close to what we expect, it's going to be transformational. It's a challenge for our industry and, quite frankly, for this generation of leaders, but at the same time, it's an opportunity for companies. And I want to take a moment to explain what I mean by that. We feel that companies need to see this in a performance context. That's just the nature of our business, in fact, the nature of any business. In that sense, companies may choose to see this as a threat, a burden, a problem to be solved or avoid, or an opportunity. And we think that companies that see it as the latter will do the best. This doesn't mean that any company, no matter how large or rich, can afford to be a pioneer or a visionary without great risk. We all need to be careful and smart. There will be plenty of blind alleys and rabbit holes to avoid in order to survive in the years ahead. When we talk about decarbonization, what we're really talking about is one facet of progress, doing the right thing for the right reasons. Progress is what we're really here for and what we find most rewarding. But progress has to go hand in hand with performance. For any business, and shipping is no exception, in this day and age, you really can't achieve one without the other. Progress and performance are integral. Is anyone finding success with regressive performance improvements, more pollution, more emissions, less diversity, or progressive initiatives that hurt performance? I didn't think so. When it comes to decarbonization, in one sense, this is very easy. Lower emissions equals less fuel burned equals greater profit. So long as there's little or no capital investment or the CapEx is justified by the performance improvement, it's a win-win. When it comes to zero carbon fuels and zero emission vessels, this becomes a lot trickier. The same rules apply, but the scope and complexity is exponential. The timing will be drawn out and the regulations may turn out to be very complex. As a consequence, it's potentially economically disastrous if you make the wrong decisions. For companies such as Ardmore to achieve success on the path to zero carbon, to turn that opportunity into both progress and performance, we really need three things. First, we need regulatory clarity on a global basis. Aoife has explained, and we can speak more about the legislative process now underway, which is being telescoped out over years. Until we have regulatory clarity, at best, we will be held back from doing all we can do, and at worst, we will be transfixed and do nothing. Second, we need incentives beyond the regulations now being discussed to encourage modern, already fuel-efficient fleets to do more. This is the vast majority of the world fleet. It's not enough to call out or improve the least efficient ships, which is what it seems to me the short-term measures really focus on. This is where the Poseidon Principles, ESG investing, insurance best practices, and even social pressure can and will play an important role, and which Ted, I think, will talk about next. Third, companies need to look honestly at themselves and ask, do we have an organization and a mindset, really a company culture, that takes all this seriously, that analyzes opportunities for improvement using all the assistance it can find, and that supports capital investment. It's not enough just to move in the industry slipstream, talk at conferences about the challenge, and wait to see what happens. This is where initiatives such as the one that Marsoft and MIT are working on can be extremely helpful, and which Arlie is going to discuss later on. I think decarbonization is an absorbing and all-important issue and a great opportunity for companies to do well by doing right. And I'll be happy to explain some of what we've been doing at Ardmore during Q&A if you're interested. But to be clear, we're all trying to figure this out as we go along. We're not alone in this endeavor. Many other companies are doing just what we're doing and maybe doing it better. And if we're to succeed both as an industry and individually as companies, we must all be humble in the face of such an enormous challenge. And we must also embrace the opportunity. So thank you, and back to you, Johanna.
At least I'm not hearing Johanna right now.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. There you go. I didn't follow Jonathan's advice. So Aoife and Tony have spelled out the vision of where we need to go, but how do we actually start making emissions reductions today? I think that's something you've been studying together with MIT. It'd be great to hear a little more about that.
Yes, John, can you bring up the slides? I've got a couple slides that I just want to talk about the journey that Marsoft has gone on as we've, as Tony puts it, tried to embrace the challenge of climate change and turn it into an opportunity. We see things through a kind of a narrow lens, if I may put it that way. We see our clients trying to make money in an extraordinarily difficult market. And deal with the turbulence that goes well beyond, believe it or not, climate change. There's so many other important things that are driving the industry. And as Tony points out, you need to perform. You need to deliver the cash to pay your investors, to keep the banks happy, and make sure Ted's very, very happy. So we set ourselves a very narrow goal, if you will. To try to find ways to reduce fuel consumption and CO2 emissions from the existing fleet to make there are really, broadly speaking, two categories of ships out there. There are older ships, vintage ships, and wonderful new ships. And the vintage ships are often considered not to be as fuel efficient as the modern ships. We wanted to close that competitive gap. We thought by doing so, if we could come up with that, increase revenue, increase value, extend the life of vessels, we had a story that could meet the challenge that Tony set for us to help deliver performance. And we wanted to move fast. We share that speed ambition that EDF and GMF have brought to the table. So as with many things, the first thing I do is go back to MIT and try to take advantage of all that's known there and all that research. And because I felt we needed to develop a robust, independent platform that could help us evaluate objectively the benefits of various alternative technologies. And we've been working with the MIT Sea Grant Lab in a collaboration, and I should say that was with the support of the High Tide Foundation that recognized the urgency of this task. That modeling process has advanced considerably. We've integrated the hydrodynamic model, if you will, with Marsoft's flagship, our economic and cycle analysis. And very critically, we've had the great pleasure to be working with leading owners like Ardmore, who have volunteered to help us look at the performance of their ships and really test out the lessons that we've learned. So as Jadick said, we've created the database where we think we can cherry pick across the industry. What are the best opportunities and how do they make financial sense? Now that project's ongoing. We haven't gotten all the answers yet, and the more we work, the more questions there are. But right now we can conclude we can meet the challenge that we set out for ourselves and make a difference now. And John, if you go to the next slide, please. And you know, it's very humbling to be on a panel that announces $1 trillion opportunity. So I had to come up with a number that at least got me into the ballpark here. All I could do was 24 billion. I'm sorry, guys. I'll try to up my game next time. But this is what we call the 5-year plan. And to put this into perspective, there are about 15,000 ships passing through their second, third, fourth special survey over the next 5 years. Each of them is going to take practical decisions now about how to improve the performance of the ships. And our analysis shows that there are a wide range of options available which can make a difference. And they not only can they make a difference, most importantly, they can deliver financially. They can deliver improved hydrodynamic and financial performance. They make sense for owners and charters. Now, you start multiplying big numbers, 15,000 ships, $1 or $2 million, you suddenly get to a large market. And this is really a lesson that we learned from GMF and EDF, how to look at scale, how to get to change not just for one ship, but for 15,000 ships. And that's where the problem, as we see it, moves away from one of technology and detailed modeling. But how do you put together an organization? How do you put together a team that can deliver on the necessary ingredients for success at scale? We think there are at least 3 critical success factors. Delivering the economies of scale. When you talk to one of the manufacturers, you naturally enough talk about 1 or 2, or in Tony's cases, many more ships. But we want to talk about thousands of ships. And we want to challenge the manufacturers to come up with a price point that makes their innovations more robust financially, given that scale. That's the partnership that we want to strike with manufacturers. We want to monetize the emissions reductions. We know this has been done in shipping already. We know it's going to be done increasingly going forward. I don't quite understand why a shipping emission reduction is only worth $3 where they're trading for $30 a ton in Europe. So I want to understand how we can get a premium valuation for what the shipping industry can bring to the market. I want to see the ship owners, the charters start buying those credits. And finally, find a way to cooperate with the stakeholders. Last thing we want to do is go into competition with charters, manufacturers, class, all this complex ecosystem out there. We think we've got a win-win solution that gets to scale, that opens up new revenue opportunities and provides cost savings at the same time. Now, that's very exciting to come up with Marsoft after our 30 years of focus on financial analysis, charter, where the market cycles are going, and talking about the future of charter rates, to see the scale of this opportunity. And we think we understand it well. We think we got the data to support it. Now we're recruiting to put the team together to make it happen. And I'd be happy to talk to you about any of those details, and anyone interested in working with us to help make this happen, I'd be very happy to talk with you. Thank you, Jahan.
Thanks, Charlie. At this point, I think it would make sense to see, as a signatory to the Poseidon Principles, Ted, how do you see the role of capital in driving change, the kind of change that Arlie and Tony have just been talking about?
Thank you, Joanna. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to Jim and the Marine Money team and all of my fellow panelists here for this opportunity. It's important that we continue to stay connected and well informed, even though we're all working remotely. I'm going to focus my comments on really what I think are some of the key themes around this topic from a financing perspective. And as I think most people in the audience are aware, shipping as an industry has traditionally been privately owned, privately financed. So the bank debt and the private owner's equity have been the main sources of capital for the business over many years. This has been shifting for some time to more of a public ownership model, also a financing model. But I feel that transition is still in a relatively early stage. I do, however, think that the investments required by this decarbonization transition are going to accelerate that transition. And why is that? I think as we've gotten a sense, the dollars involved here are going to be significant, among other things. I really think that many of the smaller and mid-sized shipping companies, privately owned shipping companies, are simply not going to be in a position to sustain their activities with the higher capital, operational, and regulatory requirements that these new mandates are going to bring. I think many will exit via outright sale of the business or consolidate their businesses with other likely publicly traded companies in ship for share type transactions so that they can keep some skin in the game. And secondly, and maybe more importantly, I think the availability of competitively priced capital will increasingly accrue to the companies with the scale of activity, with the liquidity, and with the ESG oriented platforms that are increasingly demanded by capital providers. Shipping's not going away. It is the largest, the most efficient, and the least polluting sector within the wider transportation space for facilitating global trade. But it does need to join the mainstream in terms of aligning its carbon emissions footprint with the broader Paris Agreement objectives. That's the mission, that's the imperative, and that's the opportunity. On the debt side, I do think the role of the traditional shipping banks will continue to shrink. We've seen capital requirements for a relatively high risk, capital intensive industry like shipping, they will continue to ramp up. That has certainly been our experience at DNB. We have responded by becoming much more selective in terms of client prioritization, capital allocation, with a resulting overall reduction in our exposure and number of clients. And guess what? A more profitable business at the same time. Definitely the influence of the Poseidon Principles will continue to grow in terms of how it impacts the bank's way of thinking, capital allocation, et cetera. At this point, 1 year in, I think it's still very early days. And frankly, with all of the uncertainty around mainly the issues we're talking about here, the demand for new investment capital from the industry has not been high. But clearly, Poseidon Principles are showing the direction of the way banks will increasingly think about the companies they choose to do business with, the companies they choose to allocate capital to. I do want to point out, however, that the Poseidon Principles are primarily a Western European bank, plus Citi, can't forget Citi, phenomenon. They really haven't been subscribed to by the main Asian providers of capital, or the main US banks for that matter either. As I said a moment ago, I do think the public markets will continue to grow in influence and engage to help fill the gap, as they have been doing for some time. But this opportunity, I believe, is different. It is significant from a dollar point of view. It plays directly into the broader ESG investment thesis, which is in such high focus these days. And on a historical basis, it's a game changer in terms of the future return and sustainability perspective for the industry and therefore for investors. ESG focused funds are the only growing segment for active fund manager these days in terms of customer influence. And it will be critically important for shipping companies to position themselves to tap into this growing pool of funds. ESG investors may not want to touch a carbon related industry, and many don't. However, we believe that there is a large and growing pool of investors with broader mandates within the ESG space who can and should be targeted. Decarbonization and related ESG issues must be addressed head on and proactively. The winners will create a cost of capital advantage, which will be differentiating over time. Early movers will be rewarded, but it will take time and effort, equal investment, in order to be successful. And this applies to both debt and equity. As I said earlier, the investments needed to achieve the decarbonization mandates will further drive transition from private to public ownership, including industry consolidation. Scale and liquidity will be prerequisites to attract necessary funding. Risks associated with investing, Tony mentioned risks, they will be significant. Investing in new technologies, they will be high. Private owners, with generational shifts also being a factor, we believe will be very reluctant to carry 100% of those risks on their own private balance sheets, but will prefer to share those risks with other investors. And I think lastly, we should not ignore the private institutional funding market, both again from a debt and equity perspective, to support the transition. These sources have provided significant amounts of capital to the initial generations of eco-friendly vessels, and I would absolutely expect them to be an important source for the industry's next and potentially most interesting and profitable phase. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. You'll be pleased to know that there's a conversation not unlike this one going to be taking place later this week with banks based in Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, and China. So hopefully that will have an impact on the global reach of the Poseidon Principles. Now, Tony, I mean, 1 year in and listening to Ted's comments and ambitions for the signatories, for a bank like DNB as one of the signatories to the Poseidon Principles, have you seen a benefit of that to a business such as yours, and what would you expect to see going forward?
Yeah, we do notice that banks are more and more interested not simply in trying to find ways to comply with the Poseidon Principles targets, but simply engaging and encouraging more of an ESG focus. We just completed financing a relatively small working capital line on much more favorable terms because of the ESG components in it. So there is a benefit. It does take some work. In reality, what you label as ESG has to be reflected by what you're really doing, and that's I think an important point to make, is that that's why we prefer to talk about progress and being progressive rather than complying with ESG requirements. But yeah, no, it's already visible, and it's only going to get more important.
Yeah. And I mean, just responding to that specifically, I mean, the extra legwork that you mentioned, one might hope that functions as a stopgap to over-ordering simply on green credentials. Have you seen any of that, Ted, for you as a signatory to the Poseidon Principles, that there's a sort of a trend towards over-ordering on the sort of the green tonnage? Or
well, again, I think I think owners are rightly very uncertain about what the right next new building order looks like from a technology point of view, and with the timing and the long life of these assets, and the time frame of the mandates that we're talking about here, the next decision they make on a new building is directly going to impact how their fleet is going to look going forward and their ability to comply. So with the, I would say, the lack of clear development on the technological side and on what does a new building look like that's going to meet these requirements, and what kind of fuels are we talking about? That regulatory uncertainty, that market-based uncertainty is very high, and as a result, owners haven't been placing orders. So I don't think it really has become an issue yet from that perspective, Joanna. I'm not just saying it won't be, but I think for the time being, it's just there's too much limbo in around the whole issue of new buildings and what are people going to order to have that, the kind of availability of financing question be the driver. If you understand.
Yeah, it also it leads us back to the sort of incremental improvements that Arlie was talking about in his presentation, and those sort of initial incremental steps that could be taken in lieu of the step change that is also needed, but is perhaps a little further down the pipeline. Tony, to what extent are you seeing those more incremental steps, of many of which you're already implementing at Ardmore, as meaningful to be that to your to your bank, to your shareholders, to charters, and what more might be needed?
I think it's important to our performance, and then it's really up to us to make sure people understand the impact of what we're doing. Yeah, so look, I think one of our core beliefs is that doing a lot of really seemingly small things that are not particularly important on their own, that adds up to potentially one big thing. So individually, any one of these things can be seen as quite small, and why bother? But they add up. So happy to describe some of the things that we've done that are have made a big difference, we think, in our performance, that goes back many years. So
yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I think one very important point to make is that when it comes to fuel efficiency and performance of ships, if you're not measuring fuel consumption and performance, you can't improve it, right? So I think one of the key things that companies need to focus on is finding some kind of a system that enables you to do that. And we were very lucky early on to almost literally stumble across a system called SkySails PM, based in Germany. Our chief operating officer, Mark Cameron, met them at a conference and looked at the sail in the sky, and went up to them afterwards and said, look, I'm not sure the sail is going to work for us, but I'm interested in your performance measurement system. They developed a terrific measurement system to prove that the sail worked. And we thought, okay, well, we can actually install that on the ships, and we can actually measure performance real time and much more accurately than just the dipstick method every 24 hours, which is what we've been doing for about 100 years. So that made a big difference. Another thing that we did right from the start was with our ships is we installed a little gadget called a propeller boss cap fin that's made by Mitsui. And I think only about 5% of the world fleet has those installed or things like them. But the reality is they don't cost very much. The payback is about 6 months. Therefore, you get about a 200% return on invested capital. And it's a life of the asset refit. Now, it only improves your fuel efficiency by 3%. But if you could apply that across a wide number of ships, it would make a huge difference, that along with other things. But again, I think there's no way to measure 3% really in our business unless you've installed a performance management system on board. So those are the kind of things that we've been building and that onto our ships and adding over time. We've done a lot operationally as well. We're constantly trying to take voyage optimization to the next level, and we're continually evaluating projects. Some of them are a little bit, I would say, a little bit out there in terms of whether they apply to tankers, but there's interesting propeller designs. We've talked to people about hydrofoils under the water, bubble systems. Of course, we've all been hearing about different types of fuels, hull paint, fuel cells. And the reason why we do that is because you never know what's going to work, and it also creates an atmosphere in the company and a mindset that's kind of nimble and looking for opportunities, and it's easier to make decisions when the right thing comes along.
Yeah. So, Aoife, we've heard both Tony and Ted talk about how capital can sort of drive change. We haven't really talked about sort of the missing link in the conversation so far, which is policy framework. So regulation and the role of regulation as sort of an accelerant to this change. Can you talk a little bit about what's needed and what the outlook for any of those needed changes are?
Absolutely, yeah. So for those who don't know, my day job essentially is to talk to the delegates in the International Maritime Organization about policy and try and convince them to put the most ambitious policy in place. So I would urge everyone listening to this, if you also agree with Tony that actually what you need is regulatory clarity to be able to move forward with all these great things we're hearing about, then I would also just say, think about maybe joining the Getting to Zero Coalition and also speaking to your policy reps at the IMO. And I'm very happy to chat to you about both, as I'm sure Johanna would be. But in terms of answering your actual questions, so for the Environmental Defence Fund, we base all of our advocacy around science, economics, law. And when we looked at the shipping industry, what we saw in terms of the economics, we've already heard, is this highly capitalized industry. Ships last quite a long time. And so we looked at other sectors that had similar characteristics, and we thought that the wind sector was actually quite similar. The first wind farms were incredibly expensive if you think about the amount of carbon they actually reduced. But the way that they got going was really a small charge on everyone's electricity bill, which created a fund that could support those early wind farms. And then the cost came right down much faster than everyone anticipated. So we think actually something along those lines in shipping would be very helpful to support the first movers, enable those who really want to move ahead, while also at the same time a charge to bring the price of oil up closer to those alternative fuels the industry is going to have to move towards. We would also say that on the basis of what I was talking about earlier in terms of the Paris Agreement, we need to keep the eventual emissions reductions in mind, base it all around ensuring those emission reductions happen. So those discussions around those kind of policies have been ongoing in the IMO for years. A lot of people are very touchy about it, and so there's kind of been a break for a while, but now it's coming back. Actually, some of the shipping industry reps at the IMO brought forward a proposal to put a small levy on all shipping fuel, which would then create a fund that could support research and development in the shipping industry for decarbonisation. It won't surprise you, I'm sure, to hear that as an environmentalist, I think it could be a lot more ambitious. It has to be a lot more ambitious to bring in the $1 trillion. What we think it needs to be is more along the lines of about $200 per ton of fuel rather than $2, so that we can actually fully decarbonise at scale within the timeline. And obviously that does sound quite ambitious and quite scary. But what I would say is that there's a huge amount of opportunities that Tony has laid out from a company perspective, and also we've heard from Ted in terms of the capital perspective. Countries as well are also realizing that this is a huge opportunity, because if you think about those future fuels, we haven't gone into the technology behind them yet, but a lot of them are actually produced from renewable energy. And in the countries around the world where you have huge renewable energy capacity, but not a lot installed yet, or not a lot of demand, they're quite often places where you could actually develop a lot of the shipping fuel. And so countries are waking up to that. But I think we will see policy in the IMO start to move much quicker. I am going to try and make it move as quickly as possible. And I would urge all of you to join me and try and really move it forward, because I totally agree with Tony. Without that regulatory clarity, you know, you don't really know where you're going. So we need to know where we're going, and it's got to be decarbonisation.
And can I just follow up? Do you think sort of in today's sort of pandemic landscape and politically polarized, do you see that the momentum at the IMO has slowed down as a result, or are we able to keep up pressure to get those frameworks in place that I think a lot of leaders in the industry are calling for?
Yeah, I actually on both sides it's quite positive. So in the general theme of multilateral progress, I think the IMO is actually quite unique and is still very much moving forward. I think the shipping industry as an industry recognizes that it itself is global. And so that is very much the story the policymakers are hearing, and they don't want bits of policy left, right, and center. Now, I personally think countries can lead the way, and things can also lead the way, but that means a lot of pressure is still being put on the IMO, and the IMO is moving forward with that. In terms of the pandemic, well, all negotiations essentially have been suspended because of that, though they are now moving some of them online, which is a really hopeful sign. But I think because we've seen this drop in emissions because of the pandemic, there's a real force to actually kind of lock those emissions reductions in and make sure that we don't just go back to business as usual. This is actually a huge opportunity to make sure everything else, we're at the very bottom of that business as usual graph showed earlier, so that the bit that we need to reduce is as little as possible. And I think the other thing I would say the pandemic showed us is that countries can actually move drastically and quickly when you think of all the different measures that have come in. So what actually we're talking about in the shipping industry is nothing nearly as drastic as has been put in place for the pandemic. So in that sense, it'll be easy from here on in.
I like your optimism, Eva. I'd have to say also that what we're seeing in the context of the Getting to Zero coalition certainly is that there's a lot of conversations at national, regional level, at global level about thinking about how a stimulus can actually accelerate the transition, be that in investment into green energy and the sorts of power to X fuels that you just spoke about. Jonathan, I wonder whether we should try and see if there are any questions from the audience at this stage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There are quite a few questions that have been pouring in. So I'm happy to take over and start asking some of those if that's good with you.
That'd be great.
So actually, we're going to kind of start back. So some of these questions came in a little bit earlier. And the first one is Eva. There seems to be a focus on ammonia. Do you want to give some kind of reasons why that is? Because that is kind of a hotly debated topic, I guess, with regards to alternative fuels.
Sure, absolutely. I will say, first of all, that it depends. It is always going to be the answer on almost any technology question. And I mean, Tony has spoken about various different ones, and I think a lot of it depends on your ship size, your ship route, all of those kind of things. So as a caveat to my answer, it depends. I'm a lawyer by training, so I have to do it. But ammonia really shows a lot of promise on a number of fronts. One is the volume of what you can actually carry in terms of how far you can go with your ship. When you compare that to some of the other fuels, ammonia seems to be the most promising. Another thing I would say is ammonia is shipped around the world at the moment. Now, not on the scale we're talking about if shipping was using it as a fuel, but it does mean that we have safety protocols, etc., in place. Now, they will obviously have to be scaled up quite a lot, but that's kind of a tick. Also, it can be mixed to a certain extent with current fuels, so you don't need to entirely scrap your ship and start again. You can do retrofits, which is really important and really promising. And I guess we have focused on ammonia for some reports from a kind of almost a simplifying vision in some ways, because you can talk about a million different technologies, and it's great that we have all of those available. But one of the things I have found, especially dealing with countries, is to simplify that message sometimes and say, look, this is the most promising, and these are the opportunities that come from that, and not to exclude the other opportunities, but to say, let's look at this one. But I agree with whoever the question came from. There is still a lot of debate, and I'm happy to get into some of that debate if you totally disagree with me. But that's some of my reasoning behind ammonia.
That's fantastic. All right, I think that's a reasonable answer, and so we'll move on to the next one, which is for you, Tony. You said as long as there is no low capex or justified. What does that mean? Ships are 15+ year assets. Why would a technology requiring 7 to 10 years payback time not be considered worthwhile? Is it not a better investment than the ship itself?
No, what I was trying to say is that there are some things that we've done and other people are doing that really don't cost a lot of money, and they should just that should just be done. But when it comes to larger amounts of capital expenditure, then as long as the investment is justified by the benefit, then yeah, you should absolutely go ahead with it, no matter how old the ship is. I mean, if you've got a ship that's got 2 years remaining, I still think you should install a PBCF, because you'll save 3% for 2 years and make 4 times the savings as the unit will cost.
Great. And that was a fantastically concise answer, because now that there are so many questions pouring in, I'm going to try to keep everyone to 30 seconds. So this one is for Ali. Can you talk about new building order book? What effect has the IMO regulations had on new ordering?
Yeah, I tell you, we've met with our customers, our clients now. We've constant meetings about where the market is. And the tremendous uncertainty about demand makes it very difficult for our clients to try to make clear assessment of where the future is. But every conversation we've had is about the reason why you can be hopeful about the dry bulk, tanker, and container ship markets is that the order book is at incredibly low levels. That's the single most important factor that drives the recovery that we see in those markets. Even with very little demand growth, and we see very limited demand growth going forward, the fact is, with a low order book, you start from a very good place. And to Ted's point, or to the question to Ted about where the ordering might be a concern, it's actually in the LNG tanker side, where new technology has kind of come in very quickly. So I think that the order book it plays a critical role right now in finding how the industry can recover. And the point that we try to make, and I think Tony's captured it perfectly, is that investing capital in maintaining and increasing the value of existing ships is a better investment right now than putting new ships on the water.
Great. And actually, maybe to you, Ted, you speak mainly in future tense. Do you already have current examples of the benefits of a green strategy for accessing financing?
I think at this point, to be fair, it's hard to say that we have concrete examples. There have certainly been a few examples of shipping companies, for example, issuing green bonds. They have been met with mixed success. The transactions were successful, but I'm not sure that the necessarily investor universe was necessarily convinced that this was really a green bond. So, to me, that just means, again, this is an evolving space within the financing sector. It's growing very quickly. Shipping generally is starting, I think, behind in the pack compared with a number of other industries, just because of the nature of the business. And particularly if you're in Tony's space, you're in the crude oil tanker space, even if you're in the LNG shipping space, a cleaner fuel. So I think there's a lot of work to be done for shipping companies to educate investors who have green mandates, who have ESG mandates, which again are growing areas, to educate them about what they're doing and to get the story out there. Again, to my mind, it's not something that happens overnight. I think Tony's absolutely correct. Arlie's absolutely correct. Doing the smaller incremental things to continue to improve efficiency and making investments that return well are smart in the absence of the bigger decisions that will have to come. But I think it's a process that companies need to get, I think, proactive about in order to kind of make their story heard, make investors understand what they're doing. And again, we think this investor universe is wide. There's a lot of different kinds of mandates, and it's getting bigger. We believe there will be people out there who will find it interesting to invest money in shipping companies when they understand the types of steps that management teams are taking to address these shorter term and longer term challenges. So a lot of success stories so far? No, but people are trying. People have to continue to try.
All right, that's great. This one is maybe kind of both for Tony and Ali. If I were constructing a ship today, what advice would you give on fuel, technology, etc., to future-proof that vessel? No, small question. Go ahead.
Clearly for you, Tony.
No. You go first.
I think the question starts, frankly, from the wrong place. You're not going to future-proof a new building investment today. Aoife's charts showed clearly there's going to be tremendous change going forward. We just don't know what it is yet. So watch carefully the collaborative efforts that are underway. Try to figure out where you might have some competitive advantage, but focus today on the decisions that you make that will make a difference to your performance over the next 5 years. And so I think what Tony said about creating an organization that simultaneously looks forward to the great range of changes that are likely to emerge and is making the day-to-day decisions about how to invest in better performance. You put that organization in place, and then you try to figure out where you're going to invest your money. Perhaps not.
I think if you absolutely had to order a ship today, it would be great to think that you could build a ship that was dual fuel ready. The problem is we don't know what the dual fuel is.
Right.
So, an ammonia, man, BMW's having an ammonia engine ready in a year or two. So it should be possible. They're even talking. I think the retrofit, might not be that complex. It's probably the engine room layout and the piping and capacity and electrical panels and that kind of thing that need to be thought through to make it easy to retrofit. But I think that would be, if you had to do something today, that would be the way to go. We're not big believers for our size ship anyway in LNG. We think the Tier 3 engine design is already a little bit problematic. I think there are a lot of reasons why the order book is so low today, and it's not just capital constraint. It just doesn't feel like we have any sense of where we're going, economically or in a regulatory sense. And until we do, the good news is that there should be a real lid on new building activity, and overall the industry should be more profitable. And that's one way to capitalize the industry to meet the needs of investment coming up.
Correct.
Okay. There have been a couple of questions coming in around the responsibility of, the ship owners and charterers. Like, how is that relationship, evolving to meet these ESG needs? And specifically, one question that came in was asking, primarily investments have been made by owner operators, though ships with charter agreements have only been upgraded with long-term agreements. How do you overcome this market failure where charter contracts are short or spot? So feel free to kind of talk about it as in general terms or more specifically to that question.
I didn't really, could you repeat that?
Sure, sorry, Tony. So, if we just start broadly, like, what's the responsibility of the shipping industry shared by owners and charterers? How is that relationship working when it comes to ESG?
I think there's a shared interest in figuring out what's the right thing to do, but at the moment we're stuck with our old patterns of contracting and operating together. So I don't think much has changed. There's certainly discussion and there's a desire, but again, until there's real pressure and therefore real opportunity that comes through, on the investing and financial side, and until the regulations are more clear, we can talk. but yeah, I mean, it's still business as usual.
And John, that means it's kind of cutthroat.
Okay, all right, I'm glad that we cleared that up. With traditional capital continuing to be challenging for many years to come, do you see tokenization, digital assets, fractional ownership, or alternative trading systems being a good alternative for shipping to consider in the near future to meet its capital needs? So I guess like alternative sources of capital.
I guess that's to me. I would say at this point, we as a bank, and we as a bank that interacts with the institutional investor market, haven't really seen, the impetus for those types of alternatives. I tried to lay out in my comments opening that how I see, the markets continuing to transform the capital markets. I'm not sure exactly what is meant by fractional ownership, but I think there will continue to be a transition to public markets for ownership of shipping businesses, because of the scale and liquidity that will provide for investors to support the investments that are going to be required. Haven't really thought about some of the other alternatives that the questioner has put forward.
No, it's fair. That's a little future forward. To Tony, what role will commercial trade terms have in accelerating the transition, and how can they be leveraged in the short term?
Again, could you just say that again, Jonathan? Thanks.
Yeah. What role will commercial trade terms have in accelerating the transition, and how can they be leveraged in the short term?
I'm sure it's a good question. I'm not sure I'm able to answer it. In terms of charter party terms, look, if we get to I think the starting point in my mind for all this is, let's find a way to be more profitable. If you're more profitable, you have capital to invest, and you can engage in all these sorts of discussions. I think that in some cases, especially with larger ships, you've seen the charterers and the customers express a lot of interest in long-term time charters with LNG-powered ships, et for this very reason. So I think that once we've got regulatory clarity, and once the capital is available, I think there'll be probably through profitability and other things, I think you'll see potentially a wave of long-term charters building the right ships, because that's really the only way that we'll be able to afford to build them. So I think that's probably a phase to go through, and maybe that's the way the industry was before 1973. For another reason, maybe we'll go back to that.
And you brought something up about like regulatory pressure, and one of the questions that came in is, what is the industry doing to pressure regulatory authorities to come up with uniform, technologically and economically feasible solutions to reduce emissions? If I don't know if that's something for you or Ali, feel free to toss that around.
Yeah, I mean, I can come in quickly and say, I mean, there's a proposal I mentioned at the IMO, and there's various other proposals. But I would say Johanna should probably answer that one in terms of what the Getting to Zero Coalition is doing, which I think is really exciting, and some great work going on there. So I would like to punt that one to Johanna.
I think much like Ted, it'll be a little future oriented in the sense that there's a lot of work underway. I think one of the exciting things that we see about the Getting to Zero Coalition is that it's really collaboration across the whole value chain. So it's together with the energy companies, infrastructure, financial institutions, institutional investors, policymakers, other institutional players, and they're collectively looking at what's needed. So of course, what's needed within the IMO, but are there other types of policies at a national or regional level that can, because at the end of the day, and one of the interesting developments or sort of explorations we've seen in our work is that so much of the investment needs to happen on land. So the ships are in fact only a fraction of that transition to decarbonized shipping. So all of these future fuels that we've been talking about, and especially Aoife talked about, so much of the investment is into energy infrastructure and production of the fuels, and that can be done at a national or regional level. That doesn't necessarily require legislation at the IMO. So there's different levers that we can pull and that we think are really promising within the context of the Getting to Zero Coalition.
Fantastic. So I think that's all that we have time for right now. I wanted to thank you all for such a great discussion and QA session. This webinar will be posted to our site later today, so keep an eye out for it there. I wanted to thank the audience for tuning in during this Marine Money Virtual Week celebration and engaging the speakers with your questions. We will see you all at the next Marine Money webinar at 2 p.m. on the tanker market, which is looking like it's going to be a doozy. The team at Marine Money thanks you for your support and participation and wishes you all well for the next session. And that's us signing off. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marine.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan.